Welcome back. So today I want to talk about closures, currying, and partial application. Three concepts that are very closely knit together. So first of all, the idea of closures. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk very briefly about the theory, explain the topics. Then we're going to go through a very simple example. I've got a very basic one here that we're going to talk about and run. And then I'm going to talk about some practical applications, because most of the videos that you'll find on currying in particular, I'll use the same sort of basic examples. So I'm going to go through something that's similar to the basic example. Then I'm going to do a real world one. Okay, so closures. The idea behind closure is the fact that when you run a function, the function naturally wants to run from start to finish, and when it's completed its running, it returns something and then can be garbage collected. Anything that happened inside of it can be thrown away. And this is a good thing. This saves memory. But JavaScript has closures so that if what is returned from the function is another function, then that function automatically has access to everything that was within its context when it was created. So everything within its scope when it was created. We've got two variables here. So I've got param, and then another one being something being passed into this function. Inside this function here, I've got access to both these variables. If there was another variable here, let's say I had let a equal 1, 2, 3, I would have access here to this as well. All three of those variables are going to be accessible. So this function gets returned, can be put inside of a variable and called at a later time, and we've got access to param a and other param. So this return function has access to everything that was within its scope at the point where it was returned. And that is a closure. This closure gets formed around the function and all these other things that are inside of its scope. So we get those returned and we can use them in the future. Okay, so that's a closure. Partial application uses closures. So what we're talking about here is a partial application. When I run this first function, this example function, I'm passing in this value param, I'm creating this variable 1, 2, 3, they're partially applied. So I'm getting back a function that some of the values have already been created. That is the partially applied part. So I'm partially applying values to this function. Okay? And currying is the process of taking a function that has multiple parameters, multiple arguments being passed into it, and then we break that function up into a series of steps, a series of partial applications. So here, I've only got two, but you can imagine that if I had a function where I was passing in param and other param at the same time, I could use them both, and whatever this code is right here, I could just pass these two values in and use them immediately, instead of waiting to call this later. So currying is breaking the function up. And that's what we're doing here. This is the simple demo. So if I had these two functions, you can see they're both taking in 3 parameters. If I want to curry those functions, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it up into a series of steps. I have to think about what's the logical progression from one to the next to the next. When am I using this value? When am I using this value? When am I using this value? And that's where I put them in this currying. So my first function, I'm going to bake a chocolate cupcake with vanilla icing. I want to bake a vanilla cake with lemon. So cupcake or cake, chocolate or vanilla for the type of cake, and then we've got a flavor for the icing. So we have these 3 parameters being passed in, and we're outputting this string. Okay, simple enough. No real need to break that up. But if I was going to be doing a lot of these, so here, this is the one for chocolate cupcake with vanilla. This is vanilla cake with lemon. If there was a strawberry cake and a chocolate cake and a peanut butter cake and a raspberry cake and a whole bunch of different flavors of cake. And then we had different styles of cakes, cupcakes, muffins, things like that. And there was different types of icings. That can grow exponentially. We can have all these different things. So we can curry this and turn it into one function called bake, where we pass in, do you want a muffin? Do you want a cake? Do you want a cupcake? It's going to return all of this, a function that's going to sit there waiting to know what kind of flavor to use for the cake or the muffin or the cupcake. It's going to then return another function which wants to know the icing type, and then it can do this. Now, the benefit of doing this is that I can then break it up into these series of steps. So I can bake cake, cupcake, muffin once for each possibility, and I create 3 new functions, one for each specific type. Then, for the flavor of cake, chocolate, vanilla, chocolate, cupcake, carrot, muffin, we call the original functions, one of these original ones that we made with all the variations. I call one of these and I pass in the flavor. And now I have a carrot muffin function where all I have to do is then add on the icing. I've got a chocolate cupcake. I just have to add on the icing. A vanilla cake or a chocolate cake that I just have to add the icing. And that's what this is doing right here. So we're logging it out. Now if I run this, let me save that, whatever I changed. There we go. There's my 4 commands, the 4 functions that I'm running right here at the end. So we created the first step and then the second step so that we could call the thing that comes back from the second step, which is our third function. The currying was breaking it up into the steps. Okay, so you can see generally how this works, breaking it up into the steps. That's the currying, the partial application, so that we've got the closure and we can get to the previous variables. Those are saved as part of the future functions. This is also how a thing called composure works. So if you're composing functions, another way of doing this, let's say I'm going to log out the result of calling my, bake function. I could pass into bake one of these things, cake, cupcake, muffin, whatever. All right, so I'm going to pass in a cake. Now I've made a cake. To that, I can say, you know what? I want this to be a chocolate cake. And then I want it to have vanilla icing. This is doing the same thing. It's just doing it all on the same line. And it lets me read from left to right what is the sequence of events that are taking place. We could do this a bunch of times. I could do cupcake for 1, cake for 1, muffin for 1. So we just change the values that are being put in there. We run it again. And here we have it. It's doing the same thing. Here's the first 4 from lines 52 to 55. Doing the same thing as the final step. We've just got it all composed together. So we're chaining the function calls together in a row in sequence that we want them to run. Okay, so currying, taking multiple arguments, splitting it up into steps. Partial application is using the closures so that we have the saved values from the previous calls to the functions built in there. We're partially applying the function. All right, now, what is a real-world example of this? Let me, because we're going to write out some more stuff, I'm just going to comment those lines out so we don't see those comments showing up down here again. Here we'll clear that off and be ready to run. Okay, more realistic example. I'm going to make calls to an API and bring data back that in the future, I'm going to extract some of the data from what I retrieved previously. So I'm going to import, actually here, we'll have to, before we run this, because this is in Node, we don't have fetch built in, we have to import node fetch. Sorry, that's what I'll write in my code. I'm going to be doing npm install node fetch, adding that to my project. I've already got a package.json file in my folder. So this installs it and adds it. Now it's available to me. If I open up, here it is, package.json, we can see dependencies, node fetch was added. So I've got the node modules folder, it's inside there. Okay, if this was happening in the browser, we wouldn't have to do this. We've already got fetch built in the browser. Okay. So I'm going to, now that I have that package available, I'm going to say import fetch from node fetch. There we are. I have that available to me now. And I'm going to create a function. And I've got some comments in the start of the function written over here. I'm just going to paste this in. Okay. We're going to be using jsonplaceholder.typicode.com. This is a free API. It just generates some dummy data for us. So I'm going to be making calls to this URL. And the endpoint is going to be one of these things. We've got posts, comments, albums, photos, to-dos, and users. All of these are available to us as different endpoints. So this plus some endpoint. All right, my function, I'm going to call it JSON placeholder. When I call it, I'm going to pass in the endpoint, make that my URL, and then we can do a fetch call. Now, I made it async just so that I can do this. I want to do let response equal my fetch call to my URL, but by putting await in front of it, I'm going to pause, let that run before assigning the value to response. Then on my next line, I'm going to do the conversion. I'm going to extract the JSON string and turn it into an actual object. So let's say data equals await the response, call the JSON method. Okay, so straightforward function as it is. There's nothing special about this right now. We haven't done any partial application. We're not using any closures yet. I am going to return a partially applied function. So here's the real world part, the real world application of what we have been doing and talking about up until now. So let's say that we are going to return another function. Inside this function, I'm going to use data. I'm going to use endpoint, and I'm also going to use a value that I pass in. So if this fetch call brought back comments or posts or users, how many of those do I want to now display? And that's what this num is going to do. Inside my function, I'm going to return data, which is whatever was returned from the endpoint previously. And I'm going to call slice from 0 up to num. So data is going to be an array. I'm going to take, if this was 3, I'm going to take the first 3 records. If this was 7, I'm going to take the first 7 records. We have that, and then I'm going to call map to generate an array of strings, which I will then join together with a new line character. All right, so now I have the partial application. This is the name of my starting function. I have to give it an endpoint so it can run. When it does, it will save the data that came back for that endpoint. So down here, I'm going to do a function where I'm going to call this. Let's do this. Let's say let posts equal JSON placeholder, and I'm going to pass in posts. This calls this, does the fetch call, gets the results, saves it to data, and then returns this function to here. Now the function that is now inside of posts has a copy of that data. Now my problem is I can't use that data. The way I've got the code written right now, I can't log it out because This is going to take longer to run than if I was to then say, hey, I want to log out what was inside of posts. I'm going to take posts and pass a number into it and call it and log that out like this. Hey, I want to write out the first 3 posts. Well, that's not really going to work that well for me because this is going to take longer than it takes the fraction of a millisecond to get from this line of code to this line of code. So I do need to make some sort of delay. And I'm going to put a sleep function inside of here. I've got one that sort of simulates a sleep or wait command. I'm going to pass in the number of milliseconds. I'm going to return a promise that resolves, uses set timeout to resolve after that number of milliseconds. So if I call sleep and pass in the number, I can then chain a then onto the end of it. So that's what we're going to be doing, is putting the call right here, this one, after the sleep. So if I say sleep for 3 seconds, I can chain a then onto the end of it. And then the function right here, this will run after 3 seconds. And we've got to put our call to that inside of here. So I'll do posts and let's do one more. We'll do posts and I'll create one called users. I'll write out 3 posts and 3 users. Users, same idea. Just give it the different endpoint. So I'm making 2 calls to this function. Both of them return a new function. But the new function has that data set as part of it. It's available. There's a closure created around that data set for me so that at some point in the future, when I call posts and I say I want this many, that's how many will be written out. Now, I don't think I actually, no, inside the map, I didn't do anything yet. So we have to go inside of here and actually write something out. So we're going to write out the number of posts or users or to-dos or whatever it is. We're going to write that out inside of this function right here. So we'll jump in here, let label equal. Now, I know just because I've used JSON placeholder before that every one of those data sets has an ID. It also has either a title or a name, one or the other. It's got title or it's got name. So I'm going to extract one or the other, whichever one it has, great. If it's got name, I'll save that. If it doesn't, we're going to get title. And whichever one of those exists, that's going in my variable label, and then that's what I'm going to write out. And we'll just pretend that we're doing some HTML here. I use a template string. This is just a string, it's not HTML, but it's going to look like HTML. Okay, endpoint. I can access this endpoint because it was part of the closure. It's available to my inner function. Okay, there it is. There's the endpoint, and then we'll put something in between, and then we'll put our label. So it'll say users or posts, because that's what we're passing in here. It'll say posts or users. And then the data from this data that came back from that endpoint. All right, save that. And now we can run it again. One, two, oh, I think I missed something here. There we go. We'll get it to. It's an asynchronous function. We're using a promise inside of it, so we want it to wait. And, oh, of course, I'm never actually calling my init function. Very important. So we're calling the init function. It's doing this. And I actually don't need to have the async. It was just the fact that I didn't have the function call. All right, one more time. Runs 1, 2, 3 is our sleep. Okay, Yes, as I had it written, I don't need the async here, but these actually do require the await because they are asynchronous functions. So we do need to await the result before we can assign it to posts. Otherwise, posts is not a function, it's a promise. So we need to wait till we get those back, then do this. And item as well. This should be item, not items. Okay. Try this one more time. And there we are. 3 posts, 3 users. I want to change this to 2 posts and 4 users. We can do that. When the page runs, it's going to go and fetch all of the posts, all of the users, and then we're just doing slice to bring it back and limit the number that we're returning. So we now have something dynamic that could pull out whatever we wanted in the future. As long as we have access to posts and users, those 2 functions, we can call them at any point and pass in the number of those items that we want to bring back. All right, so there it is. Currying, closures, partial applications, and a real-world practical example. So I hope that helps you out. Hope that helps you understand the 3 concepts. And as always, thanks for watching.